Good evening, everyone. I am Gwen Bird, Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. I want to begin this evening by acknowledging that we are gathered tonight on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. It's so important for us to situate ourselves in this way as we continue to work on all levels toward a more equitable relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and address the legacies of colonialism still very much with us to this day. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here for the culminating event of our One Book, One SFU initiative this year. This is the 5th year that we've done this, and I'm tremendously proud of the impressive list of books and authors that we've featured with this series. Every year we choose a book for this common reading program and make more than 100 copies of it available through all 3 locations of the SFU library, and they fly off the shelves. This year was no different. This year, for the first time, there was also a book discussion group that focused on Washington Black, based at the Bellsburg Library at SFU Vancouver, and we have at least one other book club in the audience with us here tonight. I'm delighted by all this activity because it helps us to raise the profile of books and reading in our community. In this case, it also highlights an outstanding work of historical fiction that takes readers on such a memorable ride around the world, across so many emotions and through time. I found the writing in this remarkable novel to be as rich and engrossing as the expansive story. Reading it was a wholly immersive experience for me, and I'm looking forward to gaining new perspectives with all of you this evening. I have a few logistics to mention. We are filming and taking photographs at this event. These may be shared in future library and SFU communications. If you do not want your photo taken, please speak to Leah, who's right over here. All gender washrooms are available on the 2nd and 3rd floors of this building. We will be sending you a brief survey for feedback after the event, and we hope that you will take the time to fill it out as it helps us to plan future events. And I will remind you to silence your phones before we get underway, please. I also want to take a moment to thank the many people who helped to organize this event. Associate Dean Karen Monroe is the conceptual genius behind this evening's program. Leah Hopton from Library Communications looked after an array of details, large and small, including logistics and promotion, and Susie Smith in my office lent a hand as she does with all things in my orbit. To all the other staff and the many volunteers, we appreciate your efforts. Please join me in thanking them all. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guests. I'll introduce both of them, and then Essie will read for us, and then they'll share a conversation. We won't have an open Q&A period at the conclusion, but both authors will be signing books in the ground floor lobby after the event. And many thanks to our friends from Pulp Fiction Books who are on hand to sell copies of books by both Omar and Essie. This is an easy way for you to support your local independent bookstore. Essie Edugyan is the author of the novels The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, Half-Blood Blues, and Washington Black. Half-Blood Blues won the Scotiabank Giller Prize, was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize, the Governor-General's Literary Award for Fiction, the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, and the Orange Prize for Fiction. The novel we're discussing tonight, Washington Black, also won the Scotiabank Giller Prize and was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize, the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. She lives in Victoria, BC. She will be in conversation with Omar Akkad. He is an author and journalist. He has reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and numerous other locations around the world. He is the recipient of a National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism and the Gough Penny Award for Young Journalists. His work has appeared in The Guardian, Le Monde, Guernica, and many other newspapers and magazines. His debut novel, American War, a good book, Omar, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It has also won a lot of awards. I'm going to go through the list again. It won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award, the Oregon Book Award for Fiction, the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize, and has been nominated for more than 10 others. It was listed as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, Washington Post, GQ, NPR Esquire, and many others. Omar lives in the woods just south of Portland, Oregon. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Essie to take the podium to begin by reading. Please join me in welcoming her.
I'm just delighted to be here this evening, and so grateful to you all for coming through. I don't know, is it still raining out there? Well, thank you for trudging through the rain to be here this evening. I'd like to start by thanking SFU for inviting me to read here, and I'd like to thank Omar Akkad, and because it's always a pleasure to share the stage. So, yeah, I was so terrified that I was going to get stuck in the elevator this evening on the way here. I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, last week, just doing some research for an article. And I was returning to my hotel at about 10 at night after a long day's research, and stepped into the elevator and just waiting to get to my room because I really want to have that bath and order some room service. And then I just hear this clicking noise. So I'm hitting the buttons and nothing's happening, and you pick up the phone to call and there's nobody there. And I'm just thinking, oh my God. But I finally got through, and maintenance luckily hadn't left for the day. So, but it was one of those things where you just, I've never been stuck in an elevator before. What do you do? So 10 minutes go by, 15 go by, I think, what's going on? And I get on the phone again, and she says, oh, they're coming. And then I can hear voices, and then suddenly the doors are opening, and I think, okay, great. But then there's a big cement wall, and just about, maybe like a foot of space, and then these little heads peering in, saying, we get you out. And I thought, oh my God. And then the doors closed again, and okay, so waiting, another 10, 15 minutes go by, and then suddenly the elevator plummets. So I was literally knocked off my feet and on the ground with the phone in my hand, terrified, and then the doors spring open and I'm on like the third floor now, and I just think, okay, this is my chance. So, but I think, okay, if the elevator plummets again, I don't want to be kind of caught stepping out, so I've got to lunge out of this thing. So I just launched myself over the precipice and kind of rolled and made it, and then, just walked up the stairs back to my room. But I just thought, I don't want that to happen tonight. I just got very, got into the elevator with a lot of terror. I thought, I don't want to muss my shirt with the leap. Anyway, so I'm reading tonight from Washington Black, which, for those of you who haven't read the novel yet, is a book about an 11 or 12-year-old slave boy called George Washington Black. And he was born on a plantation in Barbados, and so he's known no other life but one of great brutality and savagery. And so at the outset of the novel, we see him living out this existence, and one day he's just very, very shocked to discover himself selected to go and live in the quarters of his new master's brother, because the plantation has a new owner, and the brother of that owner has suddenly turned up. And when he gets this news, he's just paralyzed with fear. He thinks this is going to be disastrous. I guess, best case scenario, if you can put it that way, he'll be assaulted, he'll be brutalized, and at worst, he thinks, I will be killed. And so he's totally surprised to find that this man, Christopher Wilde is his name, nicknamed Titch, is completely unlike every other white man that he's known until that moment. So Wilde is a gentleman scientist. He's an illustrator, he's a naturalist, he is an inventor, but he's also an abolitionist. And it's through his taking Washington out of the fields and teaching him to read, but mainly to draw, that Washington starts to feel his first stirrings of personhood and to understand that he is gifted and has things to offer the world as well. But it's a bit of a sad thing because he has to leave, the few connections that he's had in that old world behind. And that's a very traumatic thing for him. So I'll just read like a short passage from the outset of the novel. Faith Plantation, Barbados, 1830. I might have been 10, 11 years old, I cannot say for certain, when my first master died. No one grieved him. In the fields we hung our heads, keening, grieving for ourselves and the estate sale that must follow. He died very old. I saw him only at a distance, stooped, thin, asleep in a shaded chair on the lawn, a blanket at his lap. I think now that he was like a specimen preserved in a bottle. He had outlived a mad king, outlived the slave trade itself, had seen the fall of the French Empire and the rise of the British and the dawn of the industrial age, and his usefulness surely had passed. On that last evening, I remember crouching on my bare heels in the stony dirt of Faith Plantation and pressing a palm flat against Big Kit's calf, feeling the heat of her skin baking about of it, the strength and the power of her, while the red sunlight settled in the cane all around us. Together, silent, we watched as the overseers shouldered the coffin down from the great house. They slid it rasping into the straw of the wagon and, dropping the rail into place with a bang, rode rattling away. That was how it began, me and Big Kit watching the dead go free. His nephew arrived one morning 18 weeks later at the head of a trail of dust-covered carriages driven directly from the harbor at Bridgetown. That the estate had not been sold off was, we thought at the time, a mercy. The carriages creaked their slow way up the soft embankment, shaded by palm trees. On a flatbed wagon at the rear of the caravan sat a strange object draped in canvas, as large as the whipping boulder in the small field. I could not imagine its purpose. All this I remember well, for I was again with Big Kit at the edge of the cane. I rarely left her side in those days. And I saw Gaius and Emmanuel stiffly open the carriage door and extend the step. I could see at the great house pretty Emily, who was my age, and whom I would glimpse some evenings dumping the pans of wash water into the long grass outside the scullery. She descended the first 2 steps of the veranda and, smoothing out her apron, fell still. The first man to emerge, carrying his hat in his hands, had black hair and a long horse-like jaw, his eyes darkened by heavy brows. He raised his face as he descended and peered around at the estate and the men and women gathered there. Then I saw him stride back to the curious object and walk around it, inspecting the ropes and canvas. Cradling a hand to his eyes, he turned, and for a frightening moment, I felt his gaze on me. He was chewing some soft, textured thing, his jaw working a little. He did not look away. But it was the second man, the sinister man in white, who seized my attention. This was our new master. We all could see it at once. He was tall, impatient, sickly, his legs bending away from each other like calipers. Under his three-cornered white hat, a shock of white hair burst forth. I had a sense of pale eyelashes, an uncooked pallor to his skin. A man who has belonged to another learns very early to observe a master's eyes. What I saw in this man's terrified me. He owned me, as he owned all those I lived among, not only our lives, but also our deaths, and that pleased him too much. His name was Erasmus Wilde. I felt a shudder go through Big Kit, and I understood. His slick white face gleamed. The clean white folds of his clothes shone impossibly bright, like a duppy, a ghost. I feared that he could vanish and reappear at will. I feared he must feed on blood to keep himself warm. I feared he could be anywhere and not visible to us, and so I went about my work in silence. I'd already seen many deaths. I knew the nature of evil. It was white like a duppy. It drifted down out of a carriage one morning and into the heat of a frightened plantation, with nothing in its eyes. It was then, I believe now, that Big Kit determined, calmly and with love, to kill herself and me. All my childhood, I'd had no one, only Big Kit, as she was known in the cane. I loved her, and I feared her. I was around 5 years old when I angered the quarters woman and was sent to live in the brutal hut below the dead palm tree, Kit's hut. On my first evening there, my supper was stolen and my wooden bowl cracked. I was struck hard on the side of my head by a man I did not know, so that I staggered and could not hear. 2 little girls spat on me. Their ancient grandmother held me down with her talons biting into my arms and cut my handmade sandals for my feet for the leather. That was when I first heard Big Kit's voice. "Not this one," she said softly. That was all. But then, some monstrous charge of dark energy, huge and inexorable as a breaker, poured towards us and picked the old woman up by the hair as though she were a boneless scrap of rag, tossing her aside. I stared, terrified. Big Kit just glared down at me with her orange eyes as if disgusted, and then returned to her stool in the dark corner. But in the morning, I found her squatting beside me in the pale light. She offered her bowl of mash, traced the lines in my palm. "You will have great big life, child," she murmured. "Life of many rivers." And then she spat in my hand and closed my fist so that the spit ran between my knuckles. "That is First River right there," she said, starting to laugh. I adored her. She towered over everyone, huge, fierce. Because of her size and because she was a saltwater, a witch in old Dahomey before being taken, she was feared. She would sow curses into the dirt beds under the huts. Rooks would be found eviscerated, hanging in doorways. For 3 weeks, she forcibly took food from a strong smith's apprentice each morning and night, and she ate it in front of him, scooping with her fingers from his bowl until some understanding was reached between them. In the smoldering fields, she would glisten as if oiled, tearing up the wretched earth, humming strange songs under her breath, her flesh rippling. Some nights in the huts, she would murmur in her sleep, in the low, thick language of her kingdom, and cry out. No one ever spoke of that, and in the fields the next day, she would be all scorched fury, like a blunt axe, wrecking as much as she reaped. Her true name, she once told me, whispering, was Nawi. She had had 3 sons. She had had 1 son. She had had no sons, not even a daughter. Her stories changed with the moon. I remember how, some days at sunrise, she would sprinkle a handful of dirt over her blade and murmur some incantation, her voice husky as though overcome with emotion. I loved that voice, its rough music. She would suck air through her teeth and squint up her eyes and begin, "When I was a royal guard at Dahomey," or "After I crushed the antelope with my hands like this," and I would stop whatever task was at hand and stand listening in wonder. For she was a marvel, witness to a world I could not imagine, beyond the reach of the huts and the vicious fields of faith. Faith itself darkened under our new master. In the 2nd week, he dismissed the old overseers. In their place arrived rough men from the docks, tattooed, red-faced, grimacing at the heat. These were ex-soldiers or old slavers or just island poor, with their papers crushed into a pocket and the sunken eyes of devils. Then the maimings began. James was the first of the new killings. Other killings followed. Sick men were whipped to shreds or hanged above the fields or shot. I was still a boy, and I cried at night. But with each new death, Big Kit only grunted in grim satisfaction, her orange eyes narrowed and fierce. Death was a door. I think that is what she wished me to understand. She did not fear it. She was of an ancient faith rooted in the high riverlands of Africa, and in that faith the dead were reborn, whole, back in their homelands, to walk again free. One night she told me of her intention. She said we would do it quickly. It would not hurt. "Do it frighten you?" she whispered, where we lay in the hut. "To be dying?" "Not if it don't frighten you," I said bravely. I could feel her arm draped protectively over me in the dark. She grunted a long, dark rumble in her chest. "If you dead, you wake up again in your homeland. You wake up free." I made a little shrug of one shoulder at that, and she felt it and turned my chin with her fingers. "What is it now?" she asked. "You don't believe?" I did not want to tell her. I feared she would be angry. But then I whispered, "I don't have a homeland, Kit. My homeland here. So I wake up here again, a slave? Except you won't be here?" "You come with me to Dahomey," she murmured firmly. "That's how it works." "Did you ever see them? The dead waked up when you in Dahomey?" "I saw them," she whispered. "We all saw them. We knew what they were." "And they were happy?" "They were free." I could feel the day's exhaustion descending on me. "What it like, Kit? Free?" "Oh, child, it like nothing in this world. When you free, you can do anything. You go wherever it is you wanting. You go wherever it is you wanting. You wake up any time you wanting. When you free, she whispered, someone ask you a question, you ain't gotta answer. You ain't gotta finish no job you don't want to finish. You just leave it. I closed my heavy eyes, wondering, is it really so? She kissed my hair just behind my ear. Mm-hmm. You just set down the shovel and you go. Thank you.
The beauty of that reading, coupled with the residual anxiety from the elevator story, is really messing with me right now. Thank you so much for doing this and for letting me be a part of it. I really appreciate it. The first time I read this book, I was struck by a whole host of things. One of which was the extent to which so many things that went into making this book needed to be absolutely perfect to hold up the other things that were making this book. The writing has to be incredibly beautiful to hold up the amount of research and to not be overwhelmed by it, and the research has to be exhaustive to make the book work. And I was left with this, I think, the highest compliment that I can pay a fellow writer, which is, how the hell did she do that? You know, you put down the book and you're just left with that question. I guess I want to start with the research. What does the superstructure look like when you start to research a book like this, and how often does serendipity step in and you find yourself walking on a tangent that you maybe didn't see going into it?
Yeah, I always say I'm somewhat of a sloppy writer, so...
It definitely shows. I was going to leave that for later, but it's just the sloppiest book.
Thank you, Omar. No, but I truly am, and I often start with the idea of characters and maybe think about them being in a situation together and, so creating dialogue. But I often don't know the overall structure of a book when I start. I have no idea where something's going. And so for this novel, I actually thought I was writing a novel about the Tichborne claimant affair, which for those of you who haven't heard of it, which is most people, it was an infamous series of criminal trials that took place in England from the 1860s right up into the 1890s, so almost 30 years of litigation. And they centered around the disappearance of a young man called Roger Tichborne, who was a 25-year-old aristocrat from the south of England, who went... he was the heir of the family and expected to inherit all of the estates and run them. But he decided that maybe as a sort of final last blast before he had to sort of settle down and get serious about things, that he would take a pleasure cruise all around the world. And his boat ended up being shipwrecked off the coast of Brazil. But his mother, she was very attached to him, and she refused to believe that he'd died, even though, there were no survivors discovered. And she consulted a clairvoyant, which I guess one does in such cases. And she was told that her son was indeed alive and well, and that he was living out his life in a warm, faraway country, and she just needed to put some effort into finding him, and he would reemerge. And so she did this. She put notices in newspapers all around the world, and it was about 3.5 years later she got a reply, and it was from a butcher whose name was Arthur Orton, also going by the alias Tom Castro. And he said he had written this letter in very rudimentary English. With the spelling in this thing was just incredible. But he's essentially saying, "Mother, it's me. I'm sorry I've been away for so long, but I need to get away. I've been living as a butcher in a small Australian town called Wagga Wagga, but I'm ready to come home now and assume my place at the head of the family and take up my inheritance." And could you also send £500 sterling so I can settle some debts? So, and she was delighted. She just instantly thought, okay, this has got to be him. Obviously, right? So she sent him the money, as well as money for his passage home. But she seemed to have like a modicum of good sense rattling around there somewhere. And she knew that the family at large would need more proof than this man's letter that he was Roger. And just by chance, there was a servant who'd worked in the employ of the family for like over 50 years, and his name was Andrew Bogle. And just by chance, he had retired to Sydney, Australia, with his sons to make his life there. He was an ex-slave who had been stolen off a plantation in Jamaica, actually, by a member of the Tichborne household when he was an 11-year-old boy. And so this young man was wrenched out of this life of servitude and, I guess, into another life of servitude. He was a page boy and then became a valet. But he ended up traveling all throughout Europe with Sir Edward Tichborne, and he got married and joined the Church of England and all of this, and had this completely different life from the one that he could have expected growing up as a young slave on a plantation in Jamaica. And so I was going to tell the whole Tichborne story through his eyes, because he was the main witness for the defense in a few of these trials. And I realized that I was much more interested in maybe the thought processes and just the psychology and of somebody who was like Bogle, but who wasn't Bogle himself, but who would have had a very prescribed and finite and tragic sense of what his life could be, and to be taken out of that and put into a world that was so totally different from everything he'd known. I thought, okay, that's where I need to begin.
How far were you into the process when you made that decision?
It was very early on, so I actually didn't get too far with there were several chapters, and then I kind of maybe got stuck. Yeah, I really loved this interaction between between Erasmus and Titch and Wash, and kind of wanted to follow that through more and see where that led.
I'm curious about one of the things that struck me about the book is this notion of the asymmetric emotional after effects of the kind of injustice and the kind of cruelty that is at the center of the historical record at this time, because you have these moments where a person can be physically free, but then there's other forms of freedom that are still denied him. And there's moments in this book where there are these people who are showing Wash kindness, but they're from a place where they're privileged enough to be able to show kindness in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then you have Wash feeling a sense of, at times, guilt about having survived these conditions that others haven't. And it seems a kind of inversion, a kind of strange residual guilt after having been victimized. And I'm wondering what it's like to sort of operate with a character who's feeling something like that.
Yeah, it's a very complicated thing.
Sorry, it was also a very rambling question. I apologize for that.
No, there's a lot to pick apart in it. But Wash is somebody who starts out with a very limited idea of what freedom can be. Just from the passage I read, this is Big Kit, who's the one who imparts to him notions of freedom and what a free life can look like, is a saltwater, meaning that she was born in Africa and has, been through the Middle Passage. And so he really looks to her for this, for her knowledge and her wisdom as to what a free life can look like. And what she tells him is very basic. The freedom to not work if you don't want to work, the freedom not to answer questions that you don't want to answer, these kinds of things. And so that's really his concept of freedom as he goes out into the world very unexpectedly and has to make his way. And I think very, very quickly he starts to come up against the limits of that. He realizes that that's a very, like a physical freedom or liberation is definitely a freedom, but there's so much that he's carrying with him psychologically that he cannot begin to be free until he solves some of these larger questions for himself, like ideas of, for him, a sense of home and a sense of parental relationships that have been broken. These are things that he really has to reckon with in order to find his place in the world. He's constantly searching for his foothold and unable to really, really feel as though he has found a place of acceptance. I think even when we end the novel, this is something that he's still struggling with, although he has a little bit more self-awareness. But I like what you touched upon, this idea that, he is somebody who is shown a lot of kindness, but it's people coming from a very privileged place to be able to, endow him with that kindness. And, they're not even quite aware that they have that privilege. And he's not aware of it until he comes into a kind of maturity. And this is one of the things that he's grappling with when he decides to, spoiler, when he decides to go and find Titch, is this idea of having been the recipient of a kind of paternalistic, sense of, being the object of somebody else's savior complex. This is something that really disturbs him because he feels like this person hasn't fully seen my humanity and seen everything that I'm capable of in a way that puts me on an equal footing with him. So that's something that he really has to accept, and that he's really troubled by, but he understands that as a black man living in this world, that there are limits to what he can ask for himself, and that's kind of part of a tragedy for him, working his way through the world. But I also like that you talked about the fact that he also understands that he has some degree of privilege, because he's been taken away from this life. And so there's that scene in Virginia, in Norfolk, where he's in the carriage and he looks out and he sees slaves picking cotton in the fields, and he feels instantly this sense of disconnect, but like a deep, 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 deep shame and guilt about his freedom. And that's kind of like the beginning of his self-awareness in the world, as and an understanding of what it is maybe that he's been saved from, but also a guilt over his, in some ways, his good fortune in having been saved.
You mentioned Virginia. I was astounded by the it's a novel of movement. There's geographic movement. And one of the things when I talk about what amazed me about the writing and the quality of the writing is how quickly situated I was once we got to each of these places. And I'm curious about how you sort of build the geographic landscape of the novel, which in this case moves around so much.
Yeah, when I set out to write the novel, I wasn't, I didn't work with an awareness that I would have so many different settings. But it kind of makes sense. I'm somebody who, within my own life, is sort of always somewhere else, moving around, and it was a way for me to kind of write about that. But also, he's somebody who is very much going through this psychological journey of trying to find himself and discover, a sense of agency. But it's like a long psychological journey for him. And I think, in a way, him moving through all of these landscapes, it's like a physical manifestation of what's going on in his mind, that he's constantly changing and shifting and looking for a new way of being. And part of his doing this is to move through these landscapes. And some of them he's forced into them, and others he chooses, he can make the choice to go, but really, it really feels like as he's moving through things, the reader is moving, literally moving through these landscapes with him, which I quite liked.
I was a little while back. I was trying to reach you to ask you questions about how we should set this up, and so I email you, and for a while there's no response, and then other people involved in this are like, "Where's Essie?" And then the pen, we're on the same advisory board, and the pen people are, "Where is it, Essie?" And then finally I get an email back saying, "Sorry, I'm in Tbilisi doing research." I thought, wow, you have such a more interesting life than I do. Like, geographically, just on any given day, you're doing far more interesting things. I had questions about space, and I had questions about time. I was listening to an interview a while back with an English-Arabic translator. She translates novels from Arabic into English, and she was talking about a word in Arabic, which is, the word is, it's a phrase, it's win nebi. And win nebi, if you and I are eating and I want you to pass me the salt, I would say, win nebi, can you pass me the salt? And she was talking about this idea that if you see that in an Arabic text, there's two ways you can translate it into English. The first is just to replace it with please. Can you please pass me the salt? And the other is to translate it literally, which would be something like, I conjure the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad to command you to pass me the salt. And so she was talking about this notion of sort of how you translate across languages and not turn it into this jarringly exotic thing. And I was thinking about this because in the book, you act as a sort of chronological translator. You're translating across time. And I was listening to this interview where you were talking about curse words in this book and how, the research is exhaustive, and then you get to the point of cursing and you think, you know what, we're going to use more modern curse words because some of this older stuff is going to sort of bring people to a grinding halt. And I'm curious about sort of how you come to decisions around things like that when you're translating, not so much linguistic translation, but sort of chronological translation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's all trial and error. I think, as you know, you're trying on things and seeing how they work. And there's this scene, I think that you're referring to, where Wash and Titch end up on a boat, and there's a sailor who's very upset because they've damaged his boat, and like basically everything he says is like a curse word. And I had originally written it with curses that were very much of that era, but they just sounded so silly, just like just ridiculous, no impact whatsoever. And I thought, okay, well, this is a case where I do have to make that translation. I do have to, put some four-letter words in here, or we're not going to get, that sort of shock of the punch of the curse word. And similarly, there's a character later in the novel in Nova Scotia whose name is Medwin. And nobody's mentioned this, which I think is interesting, but for me, he has a very, it's sort of like a patois, I guess, between a kind of 19th century mode of speech, but much more so like a 20th century kind of almost like a jargon, like a Chicago slang sort of way of speaking. And I kind of felt like that was necessary because it really plays against the way that Washington is speaking, which is very formal diction, very much in keeping with the 1830s, and very, sometimes a little bit stiff. And here's a guy who is so colorful and lively, and so I just kind of needed to make that tweak so that A, they didn't both sound exactly the same, and B, it was a way to kind of create this character, I guess, from the inside out to reflect all of his boisterous ways and his energy through a slightly torqued, more modern, more, I guess, rollicking kind of speech.
I'm curious about the sort of, once you construct something like that, and then you go into the editing process, where you're coming in, you're working with an editor, and you've done so much research, and you've made so many of these decisions that there's no template for. You've sort of made that. What sort of feedback are you immediately getting on the text, and how much of it is results in you having to explain that, the reason I did this is because historically this, or because I've made this decision? What's the editing process like for a novel like this?
Every novel has its own issues, and I feel like with every novel I've worked with a different editorial team, with the exception of in England, I had the same team. And, they're very sort of, my publisher is Serpent's Tail in England, and they're very good at sort of working with, whatever your vision is, we're very interested in sort of, so there was no real pushback. But I think if you're lucky enough to have an editor who's kind of swimming in the same direction as you, then it's, these aren't sort of too painful, these conversations. I mean, they can get painful. They can go to places where you're butting heads. But I think I've always appreciated having editors who will just say, this is not right. This doesn't feel right. And often it's, this just doesn't feel right. There's no sort of template on how to change it, like do X, Y, and Z. And I've always appreciated that, because I do want to know when something feels wrong, but I also don't want to be told how to change it. Mm-hmm. I think every writer needs to kind of find their way to a solution. And so I've been really grateful to have good editorial.
I had this conversation 2 days ago with my editor where we were talking about what I hope will be the new manuscript, and 90% of it was just, this is wrong. Well, what's wrong with it? I'm not sure. How do you fix it? I don't know. It was just that over and over and over again.
But how do you work? Does that bother you, or do you feel like that's a good thing, or do you want kind of directions or suggestions on how to change something?
No, what I want is the best of both worlds. I want him to tell me exactly what's wrong with it and how to fix it, and then for me to somehow feel like I still figured it out on my own.
Oh, right.
That I think would be perfect. I still go back to the story. Whenever something bad happens to me in the publishing world, and I want to convince myself that the publishing industry has no idea what the hell they're doing, I always go back to the story of Half-Blood Blues getting published or not getting published in Canada, and the story of how that came about. And I'm just... Do you look back at that now? Has anybody ever apologized? I guess, is the question I have.
Yeah, people did apologize, which I thought that was really lovely. That because, I mean, as writers, how often are we ever sort of vindicated, or somebody actually sort of, eating crow to kind of, but yeah, some people did, which I appreciated. Yeah.
Had it been nominated for the Booker by the time it sold in Canada?
Yes, but it was just like purchased by Patrick Crean at Thomas Allen, like maybe like a month before it was nominated for the Booker.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is...
So it's just to make a long story short, Half-Blood Blues was universally rejected everywhere, with the exception of in England. A small house called Serpent's Tail had purchased it for a very modest sum, and I still publish with them to this day. I am so loyal to them and think they're great. But nobody in Canada wanted the book. It made the rounds. Nobody in the States wanted the book either, but it made the rounds, and everybody rejected it. And then I did some edits, and it made the rounds again, and everybody rejected it a second time because that's, it was just, that's how it is. And so I was in a situation where I had no Canadian publisher for a book, and I'm a Canadian writer, and it was still coming out in England, but that sort of didn't, it felt disconnected and very distant. And then my partner, actually, who's also a writer, secretly sent the manuscript to his editor, and he rejected it. But then I did some more work on it, and he was convinced to look at it again, and he said he took it with him on a flight, and he read 3 pages, and he said by the time he landed in London or wherever he was going, he was just so frantic to buy it. And then he got on the phone and finally got permission to buy it, and he did. And then I think, a month later, it ended up on the Man Booker long list. And then the fortunes it was a complete reversal of fortune, and everything went very well from then on. But same book. There were very few edits made, but it was essentially the same book. But it really drove home to me that, if somebody tells you no, you should keep going, because it's such a fickle business, or it can be, and you never know where things are going to end up. And this was a book that had been just so pilloried and disliked, and then all of a sudden, when it started doing well, then I started hearing that, no, in fact, these people had been delighted by the book. So, so it really goes to show you that, maybe the first opinion isn't always the right opinion, but also that luck plays a huge part in success and in how people get to where they're going. And if I hadn't had, just that stroke of good luck, I don't know that I would still be writing.
I've been thinking a lot about the process of writing a book after you've written a book. I've written one book. I now have written a second book. And through the whole process of it, there was so much wasted brain power on what will people who like this part of the previous book think of this. And I'm operating sort of down here, whereas like commercially and critically you're operating up here. And I'm wondering if...
Come on, Omar.
I mean, we could literally Google it right now and I would be proven right. There is no metric by which that statement isn't true. But what I'm trying to get at is the idea of have the anxieties changed, or have the expectations changed, or do you feel that sense of thinking about what readers of previous work are going to think of the new one, or are you able to sort of set that all aside and focus on the job at hand?
No, I think you definitely think of your readership, and if you've done a book and it's been I guess critically successful, then you are sort of and also has garnered a readership, then you do sort of question, should I do that again? And I know after Half-Blood Blues, there was from some corners the expectation that I would write another World War II book, or that I would write another jazz book. And I knew I really didn't want to do those things. And so I think, for me, I think this is why I do a lot of hand-wringing after I've finished my book tour or something. Like, I'm supposed to sit down and actually write. I'm somebody who can never just sit down and get on with the next one. Between my first novel, which was published in 2004, and Half-Blood Blues, there were 7 years. And that was mainly due to not being able to get published, but also what do I write next? And again, 7 years between Half-Blood Blues and Washington Black, and there was quite a bit of hand-wringing. Like I didn't know what I wanted to write. I just knew I didn't want to repeat myself, but then if you don't sort of repeat those subjects, are people still going to be interested? But I think I'm a writer who has to do something just drastically different from what I've just done, or else it's boring for me. I'm not going to finish if I'm writing the same thing. I'm asked often if I'm going to do a sequel to Washington Black. I think because the ending is so, feels open-ended to some readers, but I just don't see myself returning to that character or those characters and that subject matter, even though I was delighting in it when I was writing it. It's cold for me now. It's
been published in many, many, many countries, many regions. I'm curious about whether there's been any kind of different reaction or different interpretation of the text in different parts of the world, or if there's anything about a reaction from a particular place or a particular audience that struck you as surprising, or maybe had a gap between what you intended the book to be versus how it was received.
It hasn't been sort of, I guess, like a cross-cultural thing, or that there was a different, that I went to a different country and felt like it was read differently. I wouldn't say that, but I recently did, I went to a book club, which is something I rarely do, but it was in a men's prison in Victoria, and they had chosen that as their book club selection for January. So I went and spoke a bit about it, but their readings, the various readings of the book were so different from anything I'd ever heard before, and were so in-depth. And there was one gentleman who, he had literally, at the end of it, he handed it to me, he had written like a a small paper about it, and it was about what was it, like indigenous cosmologies in the book, and he had picked out very specific places where he thought there was a theme of reincarnation. And when he spoke about it, I thought, that's quite brilliant. Like that, I should use that. That really is, but just their readings were so, they picked up on the tiniest things and were sort of, gave them great weight. And in some cases it was, just totally eye-opening. And in others I thought, that's so strange that's what you're, but it was, to me, that was one of the best experiences I've had in terms of meeting readers. They put a lot of thought into their reading.
I mean, this time last week, I was in Valley State Prison in California, in Fresno, doing there was a group of students who are in the prison, and there's a reference in the book to camp patients, and there's a couple of references that are related to Palestine, and literally, I've had 2 human beings in the last 3 years pick up that reference, and one of them was a student in this prison group. It is an astounding experience to do. I feel like we've reached the give Omar advice portion of the Q&A, so I just want to ask you a couple of things about. You all can listen along if you want. I mean, at this point, it's purely optional, but I write bleak books. I don't think this book is bleak, but it's certainly not shying away from cruelty that is not invented cruelty. It is cruelty that is in the historical record. And I'm curious about when you're writing something like this and you're that close to it, what is the process of self-care like? How difficult is it to write about this and be unflinching, and what do you do to make sure that it doesn't become sort of overwhelming to you?
Yeah, I think initially, like in the very earliest draft, it was something where I felt myself very much shying away from depicting violence. And I mean, you can't write a novel set on a plantation with slaves and not depict violence. It was just, I don't know why I started like that, but it was it was really difficult to, first of all, to do the research and read about that brutality, but then to have to turn around and reconstruct it on the page was even more difficult. I think I just let myself take breaks when I needed to take breaks, finish early for the day, go for a walk, play with my kids, this kind of thing, and just not, not engage with it. There were times when I allowed myself to write a different part of the book, like maybe writing about Wash's discovery of the natural world and his drawing, and because that gave me great pleasure to write about him drawing. So there are just these things where you give yourself the space to have some distance from it and to decompress and clear your mind. But how do you manage it? I mean,
badly. I mean, you get to this place where if it was an abstraction, that would be one thing. But if you're tying it to something real, then it's almost a dereliction of duty if you don't treat it that way. I mean, anyone who's read American War will know I'm a hypocrite for saying this, but I don't like violence in the media I consume. I'm not a fan of it. But if you're going to say a thing, you say the thing, And it was extremely difficult.
So what did you do for self-care, though?
One of the things that helped the most was, at the time, I had no agent, I had no publisher, I had no expectation this thing would ever see the light of day, and there was a freedom to move that doesn't exist now for this new book. There was a freedom to think about it in ways that I should be thinking about this new novel in, but I can't make myself do it, because now I have a publisher and the damn thing has sold, so it's going to go out into the world, and all of that makes it more difficult, but it was strangely more liberating when none of those things were in play. Right.
I was going to say, how has your work process changed since you have a publisher and they were waiting for this book versus when you were doing American War and there was nothing in place? like aside from the liberty that you felt to sort of like, have you changed the way you tackle your work, or?
Well, I'm filthy rich now, so that makes a big difference. I mean, I'm making book money, which is, I mean, I don't need to tell you, it's so broke. You live with the expectation that there was this voice in my head, and it was the loudest voice. And it was, when I was writing American War, it was, you're wasting your time. You're not good enough to do this. You'll never get it published. These are hours you could be spending being a useful human being. And then the book comes out, and you think that voice is going to go away, and instead of the voice, it's sort of a vector. You know, it doesn't change the magnitude, just the direction. So now it says, you were a one-hit wonder. You'll never do it again. It's, you know, and I've now come to terms with just this vector is always going to change direction, but never magnitude sort of thing. I mean, you said this in one of the interviews, I think, when you won your second Giller Prize, and then saying something like, well, now I don't feel like a one-off hit or something. And I remember listening to that and once feeling very comforted by it, but also it's just like, there was an absurdity to it, of someone who's reached this pinnacle, being like, yeah, maybe I'm not that bad, you know? Like, I don't know if all authors share this kind of sense, or whatever's responsible for that statement must have subsided a little bit now.
You know what? No, in a way, because I think every writer knows when you finished a book, you know how to write that book. Like, you can write that book in your sleep. If I wanted to do Washington Black 2, I could write it in 3 months. Like, I know how to do that. I know his voice, I know his motivations, I understand the other characters. But when you're confronting new material, it's all new. It's almost like this absurd thing where you're not bringing knowledge from other books. I mean, I guess you have the tools, but it's always like a steep learning curve for me. And so I always feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. And all of my books have literally taken 10 drafts to be what they are. And that's because I really, I'm trying to, I guess, gather the new tools I need to confront this totally alien material that I've now mired myself in.
I'm being told that we have 5 more minutes, so I want to ask you one last thing. I just have to ask. Film, TV rights, has it sold? Are there plans?
Yeah, so Sterling K. Brown, so his production company, along with, so he teamed up with 20th Century Fox TV to create the book, to create a limited TV series that will be on Hulu. It's like a whole tangle of things. So I think they're just in the writing stages right now, and I think I'll see a script, I was told, like in a month or something. So, and they're going to go to pilot, I think, so that'll be good.
Are you keep a distance from the process, or are you, I want to be really involved in the process, or sort of halfway between?
You know, I don't think that they want me to be involved in the process. I don't know, I think it's probably hard for the writer of the source material to sort of be lurking, but no, they've very graciously said that I can, you know, I'm executive producing, so I can come in and be a part of the process, but I'm not the writer. I understand I'm not a screenwriter. I don't have those skills, and so, I think I'm involved in that. I can give my input. I can sit in the writer's room, which I'm excited to do, because I mean, screenwriting would be a great skill to have. We'll see. We'll see.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Essie.
Thanks so much to both of you. I cannot believe the humility on this stage. It was wonderful to be able to feel that we were guests in this very intelligent conversation between two very, very gifted writers. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to get some more insight about your process researching and creating Washington Black. One more round of applause. Thank you all again for joining us tonight and for reading with us. And I'll just remind you that Pulp Fiction Books is out in the lobby on the main floor selling books by both Omar and Essie, and both authors will be available for signing books. Thank you very much.